You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm really excited. I have a guest who is an art historian, art advisor, all-around expert, and entrepreneur specializing in Buddhist art and art history, and so I am very excited to learn a whole lot today. Thank you very much for joining me, Guoying Stacy Zhang.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm always really excited to get to meet new people who have an expertise in areas that I am curious about, but honestly, I don't know a ton about. And I know there's a whole lot more than what I got in my, survey courses and stuff. But before we get into that, you're doing a really interesting project, bringing Buddhist art and culture to people through a digital platform, correct? Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing there? And for listeners who want to learn more, check the links in the show notes. But can you start us off with that?
Yeah, sure. So I started Buddhaland about 2 years ago. First, I was inspired by this whole NFT craze. I was impressed by how they came up with their own culture, with a collection of artwork and with different traits. And then I thought, actually, Buddhist art will be perfect for that because you have Buddhist statues from different cultures. They have different hairstyles. Informed by local cultures. And then you also have different hand gestures as mudras. They have very profound meanings. And then I thought, if we want to make Buddha statues in digital age, what will they be like? I was thinking they should be made in voxels. They shouldn't have a concrete form, and they can be very colorful, not just in gold, but also in fire or in rainbow. So that was the beginning of Buddhaland. But as I delve deeper, I also see a lot of problems that I can address on this platform. For instance, and I've worked with Christie's and Sotheby's and other art institutions. I feel that in contemporary world, the value of art is often defined by the price tag. But originally, art is something for humans to seek deeper meanings and express spiritual pursuit. So I want to highlight artists who are still doing that in our time. And then I also felt, because of Buddhist art, I encountered Buddhism, and I agree with the philosophy and the vision. And I want to bring together spiritual practitioners and tech business leaders, because when I know more about blockchain and Web3 and AI, I feel a lack of humanity there. And I think in general, business and technology, they don't really have a direction in themselves. So if we can use art and spirituality to inform the direction of our business and technology, I think that would be very beneficial for humanity. So that's the two main pillars of what Buddhaland do. So we make NFTs, but that's just as a way to show how art, spirituality, and technology can coexist, and also to inspire. And we discover and promote young artists who create with spiritual themes, and we bring together spiritual practitioners and tech business leaders to explore big questions that we're facing today.
That's interesting. And it's it's interesting to me with this idea of, Buddhist work and spiritual work sort of getting beyond the trappings of physical forms and into this digital space, where it can be distributed and spread and seen and appreciated and understood in a new and different context. And so I think that's really cool. And I would encourage listeners to, as I said, check the links in the show notes if you want to learn more about that. But that's sort of contemporary aspects of, Buddhist and other spiritual art. If you wouldn't mind, can we go back a little bit further, and can you tell us a little bit of the history of the development? And I feel like that is such a difficult question because I'm asking you to talk about, hundreds and hundreds of years of history across different cultures. Yes. If you could do that in like 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, in 5 minutes. Okay, I think maybe we start with Buddha instead of starting from art. So as many of you may know, Buddha is a historic figure, and we know that he probably lived sometime between the 6th century to the 4th century BCE. And he was born as a prince. A prophet told his father that, your son will either become a great ruler or become a great spiritual leader. Of course, the father wanted to keep the son, at the palace with all the luxury, with all the pleasure. But when Buddha reached 29 years old, he went out of the palace and he saw old people, sick people, and a corpse. Then he started to question the meaning of life, because before that, he wasn't thinking that this will happen to him because he's had such a wonderful life. But then he realized that this is the life that everyone is going to experience, everyone is going to die. He decided to leave the palace and search for his life purpose. And he started to learn with different teachers, and he experienced a lot of extreme life events, and he was near death, but he couldn't find the answer. But one day a village girl offered him some food. And then he realized that the path to awakening is through the middle way. So he continued to practice meditation, and at the age of 35, he attained enlightenment. And then he decided to spend the rest of his life to share his teachings with people, from different classes, whether it's women or men, and whether they're from wealthy family or maybe they're from low caste. So that's kind of the life story of the Buddha. And we have Buddhist art depicting all these episodes of the Buddha, from when he was a prince, and when he went on the quest, and when he was teaching, and also when he passed away, attained nirvana. And then we also have his disciples, we have the monks. So that is one big genre for Buddhist art. And then as Buddhism was introduced to different places, to Southeast Asia, to Central Asia, to China, to Tibet, then Buddhism interacted with the local culture. And you have even more representations of the Buddha. And then in Mahayana Buddhism, in China, and also Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet, they have different focuses. For instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, you have a whole school of different deities, wrathful deities or peaceful deities. and different ritual practices. So it's not just about painting and sculpture anymore. Then you have ritual objects. And in Chinese Buddhism, you have different bodhisattvas, different architecture. So yeah, indeed, it's a very big question. So I can find the beginning, but as Buddhism develop in different regions, there are just endless stories and representations of the local people to show their piety, to show their devotion through the art form.
Yeah, and if I could just go back for listeners who might not be familiar with the reference, when you talked about we talked about the Buddha, but then you also mentioned bodhisattvas. And correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of a bodhisattva is a person who has meditated and is basically like reaching enlightenment, but forgoes like that transcendence in order to stick around and help other people to reach enlightenment. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So Buddha means the enlightened one, and in Sanskrit, and Bodhisattva means enlightened being. So, like Buddha, they are enlightened as well, but they decided to stay with us, to help more people to achieve enlightenment. Especially in Chinese Buddhism, which is also practiced in, let's say, in East Asia in general. So like Korean Buddhism or Japanese Buddhism, they're very much modeled on Chinese Buddhism, with the Chinese texts and the practices. Of course, they have their own interpretations and elaborations later. We have, for instance, we have Guanyin. I think it is the most famous bodhisattva or Avalokiteshvara. He was maybe more in the male form in ancient India, but in China, people represent the deity more as a female, as a compassionate female, because Guanyin is a symbol of great compassion. And in Chinese Buddhist texts, we have Guanyin can turn into different forms depending on who she meets. For instance, if she wants to help a child, she will turn into a child to talk to the child. If she's talking to a minister, then she will turn into a minister to be able to communicate with them and to teach them, to help them. So this bodhisattva ideal is very important in Mahayana Buddhism, which is practiced both in China and in Tibet. For Buddhist practitioners, we should walk the bodhisattva path. It's not just about improving ourselves, but also to benefit all sentient beings as much as we can.
Now, if we could get into, a little bit about the art and some of the symbolism, because my understanding is when we look at Buddhist statues and other artworks, we often see different sort of hand gestures, which mudras, correct?
Yeah.
The term for and there's symbolism to some of those hand gestures and poses. We see I think of the Buddha is typically depicted with the longer ears and some other characteristics. Can you get into a little bit of the common symbols that we might see and associate with Buddhist artwork and how to understand and make sense of the image that we come across in the museums and other contexts?
Yeah. So actually, in early Buddhist art, we rarely see the depiction of the Buddha himself. If we go to, for instance, the Sanchi Stupa, one of the earliest Buddhist architecture that we know, we see all kinds of symbols to represent the Buddha. For instance, the Bodhi tree, or the empty throne, or the wheel. but then we still see devotees surrounding all these symbols to indicate that it is the presence of the Buddha. So we also have aniconic representations in early Buddhist art. And then gradually, some people say that it is because of the Greco-Roman influence. There was a growing preference to represent Buddha in a human form. I'm not sure about that, because in early Buddhist texts, we also have stories where in Buddha's time, his followers made a statue of him. Although, he did not like the idea, because he said that, you shouldn't worship me. But people still, did that at that time. So we don't really know what exactly happened that you see a flourish of representations of Buddhas. And we also have textual evidence of what Buddha looked like. So there are 32 auspicious signs of the Buddha. Some of them are impossible to depict, and it doesn't really sound very normal. But for instance, when Buddha stand up without bending, his hand can reach the knee. So very long arms, yeah. And then you also have the Buddha had golden skin, which is possibly the reason why we see a lot of Buddhist sculptures are gilded. And then the Buddha had a very big tongue. So all these descriptions, but usually we don't see them depicted in Buddhist art at all. But there are a few key elements that are very prevalent in the representation of Buddhas across regions. For instance, we have the Ushnisha. That is the protuberance on top of the head. Sometimes you see a top knot or maybe a hair, but in Chinese it's called 肉髻. So it's actually the shape of the head, and then you have hair as well. And also you have the Uhna. Sometimes we'll call it a third eye, or in the position of the third eye. It's actually circular hair according to Buddhist text, but most of the time we see a dot. So both of them are a symbol of enlightenment.
Oh, interesting.
And then Buddha has elongated earlobes because he was a prince. So he was wearing a lot of heavy jewelries. So when he renounced everything, but his ear was like that. So it's kind of a reminder of his royal past.
Interesting. So we have a lot of the physical description. And I'm curious, as you said, that we didn't really have so much of early depictions of him, just symbols of him in those earliest, like in the stupas. Was that purely because he said just like, well, don't worship me, it should be more about the ideas and the symbols, or because he had transcended the physical human form, and so we just need those symbols? Because I also think about, like, there are some religions where it is blasphemous to be depicting certain figures and stuff like that. Was it something that was almost like a taboo, or was it just like not necessary?
I would look at it in a more emotional way. So as I mentioned, in Buddha's time, I think he was away for some time, and one of his follower really missed Buddha. So, they just decided to make a statue of Buddha to still have his presence. And I think it must be the case for all the followers of the Buddhas later, after his nirvana. Although, he did not advocate this idea, because a lot of people think that Buddhism is about the Buddha, but what Buddha really wanted us to learn is we need to rely on ourselves. we need to develop ourselves. We need to be an island upon ourselves. And that was his last teaching, basically. I think that is the reason why Buddha did not want people to spend so much time, making images for him. However, because Buddhist teachings touched the hearts of so many people, and they really miss the presence of the Buddha, they want to express their devotion to him, then it's kind of like emotional, you just want to do that.
Yeah.
I think in Buddha's time, he also compassionately allowed it. And there's no crime in it. Mm-hmm. So people just started doing that more frequently a few hundred years later after his passing.
Okay. Now, I think it is about time for an ad break. So after a short break, I want to get your thoughts on a specific work. And you actually pulled up one from my hometown museum and my old alma mater. We've got a statue from the Art Institute of Chicago that we're going to be talking about because it's got an interesting history and still new developments happening. So we'll get into all that in just a minute. So we're back with Guoying Stacy Zhang, an expert on art history and Buddhist art, an advisor and entrepreneur, just a doer of all things related to Buddhist art and art history. And today we're talking about a piece that you actually brought to my attention, which is a little bit embarrassing because this is at the Art Institute of Chicago, like my favorite museum and the place where I went to college. But while I've seen this work, honestly, I had not known much of the history to it. So can you explain a little bit about the background, and then we'll get into what's happening with it now and the ethical implications and the sort of questions surrounding it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when I read the news, I was actually first drawn to the art aspect of this piece. So this is a stone carving depicting Buddha sheltered by the Serpent King Muchalinda. This happened after Buddha's enlightenment. So he was meditating under the Bodhi tree, and he attained enlightenment, but he continued to meditate. And then all of a sudden, a storm rose, and all the waters also rose up. So it was a very dangerous time for the Buddha. And the Serpent King was very moved by Buddha's determination and spiritual radiance. So he decided to coil up his body as a seat for the Buddha, and then cover the Buddha with his hood. Yeah, so that is the story itself. In terms of the depiction, I find it very intriguing because usually we find this motif in Southeast Asia, particularly in Cambodia, in Khmer culture. And they also use stone, and they really mastered the craft so well. And here we see a depiction from Nepal or Newari Buddhism, where they seem to have their own creativity. In Khmer culture, usually the Naga has 7 heads, but this one has 5 heads, which is closer to the early Indian samples. But in an early Indian depiction, we only saw kind of this, only the Naga king without the Buddha. So it's also an iconic representation. But here we have the Buddha, and then we have a reference to an early Indian motif. And also the body of the Naga king is braided together. So it feels like there are actually 5 Naga kings instead of 1. So everything about the representation here is very fascinating to me.
So that's interesting. The first question that I start to wonder about as you talk about, a 5-headed or a 7-headed snake or multiple snakes braided together, because it does have this woven aspect to it. I'm wondering, is there a significance to the number? Like, how in various traditions, numbers can take on symbolic meaning. Is there a specific reason that 5 or 7 might be selected in a depiction like this?
Yes, you're right. In Buddhism and Buddhist art, numbers play a very important role. For instance, we have the mala beads. We have 108 beads to symbolize 108 worries or problems we have in human life. And that is something that we need to overcome to attain enlightenment. And for this one, I'm not sure whether there is any significance in terms of numbers, but after Buddha's enlightenment, he actually spent 7 more weeks to meditate. So I'm not sure whether that is the reason why in Khmer culture, the Naga king has 7 heads. And there are 5 here. It's also not very clear when the Naga king appeared. Some say that it is in the 5th week of his meditation. So maybe that is the reason the earlier depiction has 5 heads. But I'm not sure about this because there are several Naga kings in Indian culture. So this is the one we know that has an encounter with the Buddha.
Interesting. So, I mean, it seems like, a piece like this, you're obviously not going to have an artist statement tacked to the back of it. The records from that time, they didn't write like, oh, I did this to do this specifically on every single piece of work. But there typically is some meaning behind it. We usually just understand that meaning in reference to other things, and we can glean what we can from that. And that's interesting, just that detail of, in the accounts, like he meditated for 7 weeks after the Enlightenment, but encountered the Naga King 5 weeks after that. That seems to me like a plausible reason for there to be a discrepancy in the heads and a symbolic connection to that.
Yeah, I also
go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to talk about the agency of artists in Buddhist art. Usually we have we already have standard there. We have the textual reference there. But quite often I find that the artists or the artisans always find a way to have their own style or regional style infused in the artwork. That's why the artworks look so different across different countries. Like if you go to Thailand, their Buddha looks very different from the Buddha you see in Tibet. So sometimes we really need to look into the local art and culture to understand why a certain style or a certain depiction or motif came into being, and why at a certain time a group of people, they're particularly obsessed with a certain motif. And in Buddhist art, I think when we look back, people often call these creators as artisans or craftsmen. They're not really considered as artists because the original, they did not really put so much original ideas into it. They're basically expressing Buddhist teaching, maybe with instructions from Buddhist text or from the patrons. So most of them are nameless, but I would say that most people, when they look at Buddhist art, they feel this spiritual essence of the art, and they feel calm, they feel peaceful, which is not often found in other types of art. So I would really want to give a lot of credit to the Buddhist craftsmen throughout history, because they do not do this for name or money. They do it to express their own devotion and to help their patrons to express their devotion and to accumulate merit. Because in Buddhism, whatever you do, whether you are making a Buddhist image, you are doing a good deed, you are making donations to people, you are accumulating merit.
That's interesting. So I think that is a really good point about the importance of creating this for the spiritual purpose, and the significance of that. Obviously, with all religious art, there is that motivation of that internal desire to express these things that you believe in, that are sacred and important to you. But I think there is something there's something distinct in like the Buddhist art tradition, whether it's the sand mandalas or these sculptures. Mm-hmm. There is something that is so soothing to me looking at these pieces. And, I don't want to be like disrespectful by talking about the aesthetics of it, but I think it's a part of it, mm-hmm. Like I know there's so much more to it, but also like I think it's worth recognizing that there's this symmetry to it that is so satisfying, whether it's through the pose of the figure or the fact that the serpent heads are centered on there, and the braiding is like the balance of it is just so visually satisfying. It's mm-hmm. it's very calming and soothing and feels at rest. And I think that's a big part of the purpose here, is that, like we're seeing the Buddha meditating. We're seeing something that's meant to be at rest or satisfied, or, not caught up in all the trappings of, our material desires and stuff like that, like just content to be in this state, in this moment, everything being all right, which I think, as somebody who is a visual artist and a lover of visual arts, I appreciate the arrangement of the elements as I'm seeing them in there. Mm-hmm. And now as I'm looking more closely, I'm noticing the earlobes and yes. I'm wondering about the pose of the arms and the hands yes. laid out. Like, can you talk a little bit about some of that we might see in the figure, in the pose?
Yes, so this hand gesture or mudra is called dhyana mudra. It's a meditation mudra. So that's how we do meditation. We even, we do meditation like this today as well. Last night, we have been organizing this online meditation session, and yesterday the teacher Campbell just taught us. The dhyana mudra, you put your left hand and then right hand on top of left hand. And then you can do like this, or you can just do exactly like the Buddha is doing in this statue. So he explained that the left hand means all our negativities. Our ignorance and, everything opposed to enlightenment. And the right hand is about wisdom and compassion. So we need to use our wisdom and compassion to suppress all our negative qualities. And then you can also see that the Buddha, his head is actually tilting forward a little bit. That's what you see in most Buddhist art. That is also to kind of suppress our throat, to remind that we should not talk right now. And then you have the shoulder, relaxed shoulder. So this posture is very important. If you don't sit right, you can't meditate well. Yeah. So if you want to do meditation, just look at this statue and how to start.
Oh, that's interesting. It's a visual artwork to appreciate, but it also gives a little bit of a guide, or we see the meditation in its idealized form.
Yeah. I think what you said about the aesthetics, I totally agree. Actually, I just find, Buddhist art is so beautiful, in any sense. And I think that's because the creators, they had spiritual depth and also craftsmanship. And then you have something beautiful that you can express masterfully. That's how I see all these elements came together in one piece of Buddhist art.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I personally, just as somebody who likes to create things, and I'm no sculptor, but just seeing this kind of work, I always picture like what it was to physically create that, the patience, the persistence, the devotion, like the precision craftsmanship. I'm always blown away by that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I appreciate when I see that kind of labor of love, because you had to invest so much in that.
Yeah, because you also mentioned sand mandala. I think a lot of people find this art very fascinating because you spend so much time creating something, and then you just destroy it and just let it go. Like you said, this labor of love, and then you still feel so detached from it. And I think that helps us to get closer to enlightenment because, you are not attached to your love or what you have given or your talent or your time or your patience. You just let everything come and go very naturally, and you are not affected by any changes. In itself, it's a spiritual practice. And also, I think in Buddhism, in Buddhist art, what is the most important thing is your mind. So if you come up with a good idea, a good intention, then everything you do is going to be good. But you don't have a good intention, and everything you do, although it may look successful, but everything will fall. That is a power of mind. So if you already create it in your mind, even if the sand mandala is washed away, the mandala still exists for you.
Oh, that's an interesting concept, that it still exists for you because in your mind and everything like that. See, I always understood the mandalas as sort of just like, it's about the process and the sort of meditative act of like centering your focus on this creative process, just slowly getting each little bit of sand into there. And I really wish we had more time to get into that. Like, that's like a whole other episode about like sand mandalas. And I think, just the symbolism in not just the design, but also the act of creating it. There's so much to that I find absolutely beautiful. I love every bit of it, although I don't think I'm enlightened enough to be able to destroy something that I had worked so hard on. But I do want to shift gears a little bit because one of the other big things that we had talked about as an important area to cover here is, this piece, the Buddha sheltered by the Serpent King, which was from the Art Institute of Chicago. Well, not from the Art Institute of Chicago. It has been housed at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's originally from Nepal, if I recall correctly, and now the Art Institute is giving it back. And now the Art Institute is giving it back, as they've been trying to do their due diligence and look at the provenance of works in their collection. They've been doing some research, and this is one that they found that they felt a need to send back to its place of origin. And I want to get your thoughts on this because, you had raised some really great questions that I'm going to pretend that I had thought of, with like, when we look at these works in a different context, in the museum context, what is your thought about that? And whether it still has the same spiritual significance and, the educational value, the cultural connections, how do you feel about these pieces being in the museum, being sent back, all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a very interesting topic, and we can also spend a whole hour talking about it. It is a very complex issue. I think now a lot of discussions and controversies surrounding all this repatriation is whether the museum has the right to hold these sacred objects and whether they are the right guardian for it. Are these statues religious objects, or they can be considered as art or tools for education? I must start by complimenting all these Western museums in terms of educating the audience, because they have their department, they have their researchers. Regardless how the pieces was removed from the original setting, as the guardian of these art pieces, most museums, they do a lot of work like cataloging them, digitalizing them, and organizing workshops and talks. So more and more people understand the significance of these objects. Because when these objects were stolen or removed from the original setting, usually there was a war in the country, or maybe the government is not stable, and not many people are aware of the importance themselves. So I would have a more open-minded approach to how these things happened. Now, different museums have different practices. For instance, at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, they had a new gallery dedicated to Buddhist art. And the sponsor of this gallery, they happen to be a very devout Buddhist family, Robert Ho Family Foundation. They actually wanted to consecrate the whole space. So they invited Buddhist monks and organized consecration rituals in the gallery. And they also paid a lot of attention on the cataloging, making sure that the captions include the language from the culture of the statue. So you have, Thai or Chinese or Burmese languages on the caption. So that is one way to do it. So if you're a Buddhist, you know that, this space is consecrated. If you are there just for your personal understanding of art and religion, then you can learn as much as possible. At University of Chicago, they have two groundbreaking projects, Xiangtang Shan and Tianlongshan Caves projects. They have been studying two cave sites in China. Most of the statues were removed either by local people or by foreigners or dealers, whatever, from the original site. And now they're housed in all the major museums in the US and in Europe. It's kind of, it may be possible to bring everything back, but at the moment, there is no such request from the Chinese government. And the University of Chicago, what they have been doing is to have 3D scans for all the objects scattered around the world, and to also scan the site and to restore its original construction digitally. That's how the two sides can be better understood, researched, and at the same time, the objects are still being displayed in museums for international visitors. So I don't know which way is better, but I think we can't really change what happened before. So whatever we do now should come from a wisdom and come from the best intention to increase people's awareness of the cultural importance and also preservation of all these Buddhist statues. For a regular Buddhist person, I guess for them it doesn't really matter. I've seen people who came into a museum and then they just pray to the statue they see, because the statue is so beautiful and inspiring.
And it's interesting to me because I'm like having flashbacks to like 20 years ago when I was in college, and I was in hindsight, I guess it was probably hats off to the professor. This was a forward-thinking assignment, but they had me go to different museums. In Chicago, we have the Art Institute of Chicago, and we have the Field Museum, which is like more of a natural history museum. And we were talking about the different curatorial choices in how work displayed. And this just got me thinking about how, like, in some museums, they try to, create a display that it's this like faux in situ kind of look. They're trying to show us the context of how this item would have been seen and encountered by the people who created it. Whereas at the Art Institute, it's the blank white walls of the traditional gallery, and we just look at it differently. We see it as an art object compared to a piece of historical significance, cultural significance. Like, we encounter these things differently. And I truly, even all these years later, I haven't figured out where I stand on like what's the best way to see and encounter these pieces, because I think there's value in seeing them in both lenses.
I think contextualization is also very important. Maybe you construct a shrine, to show the context, or maybe you try to give more information and do more research about a certain object. Because a lot of Buddhist statues, when they were physically removed from the original site, the people cannot take everything, so they actually just took the head. So that's why you see so many heads of Buddha in museums, and a lot of people in the West, they thought that they were made in that way. They thought that, a Buddhist statue, they are just this head of the Buddha, but actually there's this whole body that are just cut off from the Buddha had. So I think these things needs to be addressed and explained. And now we have so much new technology. And I think either for museum displays or research or cultural preservation, we have more tools these days, and we should really make best use of them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, people like you creating digital platforms that are helping people to spread these ideas and look at works in a different way, and any different way we can look at them is always welcome in my view. I really appreciate your taking the time. And before I wrap up this episode, I do want to ask you any parting thoughts or big ideas you would want listeners to share and bring to their viewing and appreciation of various Buddhist pieces.
I would say something more Buddhist than art. I think there are a lot of teachings that really touched me in Buddhism. But I think one thing that I want to say at the end of this episode is we are all interconnected and interdependent. And we can all become Buddhas. That is the teaching of Mahayana Buddhism. So when we look at these Buddhas and we hear about Buddha stories, we feel so inspiring and we really look up to him, but actually he's just a role model for and we can all become Buddhas, become the enlightened one.
And I cannot think of a better way to end this and a better, more beautiful thought than about us being all connected, and being mindful of that, I think, is really important. And I appreciate your taking the time to share your thoughts and insights, because I think the art is beautiful and it only becomes more beautiful when we understand it better. So thank you once again. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you too. Thank you so much.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.